All right, so now that you know a little bit of background about the Kingdom of Nigeria prior to imperialism, let's talk about it now a little bit more when it comes to Nigeria as a colony under the British. So when the British start moving into this region in the mid 1800s, at first they are going to practice a form of direct control in which they use military troops to more or less control the region and the economics. Later, they would shift to indirect control through the majority group in the region, which we'll discuss in a moment. But through and through, whether they were practicing direct or indirect control, the main objective was, of course, to exploit this region for its resources, as well as to influence its political structure, as the population of Nigeria was rather large back then, and it is one of the most populous nations in Africa in the modern day as well. This would lead to significant changes in the region's economic status, as it would very quickly industrialize after being used for the palm oil trade during the early years, and then later this would eventually pretty much structure how the leadership in the country would develop even after gaining independence from Britain. So let's take a look at that. So when we talk about the modern day state of Nigeria, back in the day, it was primarily being the area that was focused on by the British would be the southern part next to the Niger River around the modern day city of Lagos. As early as the 1850s, the British went into this region and annexed it. They primarily did this through more or less forcing the local population to sign treaties and pretty much any type of resistance that kind of came about from the group that lived there was met with military violence. The British brought machine guns with them. They were well aware of what they were doing. And on top of that, it didn't help that, even though firearms had kind of been circulated in this region, that they weren't really up to par as to what the British brought with them with the use of machine guns, whereas many of the firearms that Nigerian Africans had would primarily be muskets. Another point of importance that you need to be aware of is that not all imperialist ventures in Africa were done specifically by governments of European nations. Some were actually funded by private investors. And actually, most of northern Nigeria and a large portion of what would eventually become the colony of Nigeria was originally owned by a private company called the Royal Niger Company. They would play a key part in conquering the northern part of Nigeria with the help of the Maxim machine gun as well, in order to dominate very early on the palm oil trade after the Berlin Conference. At this Berlin Conference, the British would also gain this area to the east of the Niger River, and by the 1880s, more or less, all three of these regions would pretty much combine under British rule, as the Royal Niger Company would sell exclusive rights to the palm oil plantations in this region to the British government. And just as a quick reminder, when we talk about the palm oil trade, this was an essential resource from Africa that many Europeans definitely sought after, primarily because palm oil was used as a lubricant in many of the industrial machines that were used back in Europe. So by 1914, as the First World War is about to break out, Britain more or less controlled the entire modern-day state of Nigeria. And at this point, they would actually start letting go of the direct control that they had been practicing over the region through their military, and started looking at other options, as it was very costly to keep soldiers in Africa, and because they had to bring them back to Europe to fight against the Central Powers of the First World War. So when we talk about Nigeria during British colonization, it's important for you to understand that there are many, many groups, ethnic groups that live inside of this country. We, looking at it today, maybe don't think it's a very large nation, but in reality, it covers a very, very large piece of land, and it was made up of several different peoples. But there were three groups that were much larger than the other minority groups, the Hausa Fulani, the Igbo, and the Yoruba. So when we talk about Nigeria as a whole, again, there were an estimated 250 different ethnic groups, each with their own languages, cultures, and religions that practiced prior to British imperialism in the region. But the big three were Hausa Fulani, which were primarily in the north and northeastern regions, the Yoruba, which were in the southwest region, and the Igbo, which were in the central region of the modern-day nation. The biggest kind of point of contention there is that one of these groups, the Hassa Fulani, had interacted quite thoroughly with the Muslim Empire when they were in control of much of North Africa and had gained a pretty strong central government that was very well organized as well as being very well armed. Whereas the Yoruba and the Igbo, the other two large groups in the region, really were just kind of getting their foothold into things. As a result, the British found it very difficult to navigate these different cultural diversities in order to maintain control and order, and in many cases ran into challenges as there's language barriers as well as just cultural aspects that a lot of these groups did not agree upon. In the end, though, they decided that they would induct an indirect rule over Nigeria, specifically through the Hassa Fulani, who they gave machine guns and more or less made into warlords. At this point, the Hassa Fulani would rule over the colony of Nigeria and were able to do just about whatever they wanted to. And it got pretty bad in many cases. In the end, the Igbo and Yoruba tried to resist. However, with the modern machinery that the Hassa Fulani they really didn't stand a chance. And the Hassa Fulani were allowed to pretty much do whatever they wanted, as long as they continued to flow resources back to Britain in answer to any demands that the British government had. So again, we start off with direct control, whether that is through the British government directly or through the private company, the Royal Niger Company, and then we eventually shift to indirect rule, as the Hassa Fulani are pretty much given local control over the colony and answer to the British. So that leads us to our final question in the last slide for today's lesson. Which forms of imperialistic control did Britain use in Nigeria? Discuss that with a neighbor. You should have some answers in about a minute or two. I'm going to ask the sub to just end this video, and after that, you all are going to start working on your vocabulary, which is due today, or you can continue working on your imperialism map project, specifically the part on Africa. Okay? And I will be back in the building later in the afternoon, and if you have any questions or need any clarifications, please feel free to stop by. I hope everybody has a great day.